Awesome. So hi everyone, I'm Kieran. I'm also the soon-to-be Chief Strategy Analyst at Reefing Priorities, and I was previously the Director of Research at Farmed Animal Funders. In addition to that, I manage the EA Animal Welfare Fund and also do something on the Food Systems Research Fund, and it's great to be presenting to all of you today. Today I'm going to present on what's needed in the effective animal advocacy movement. For those of you who might not be aware, effective animal advocacy is just the prong of effective altruism that focuses on animals. And I'll be giving the presentation on this topic for about the next 15 minutes or so. There's only 9 slides. After the presentation, I think we'll go to some questions, potentially we'll open up to the floor for some questions. And I feel like there's a lot to cover, so I'm just going to go straight into it. So first, I'm going to start by outlining some caveats and limitations. In this presentation, I'm only going to very quickly go over some of the key points. I've gone for breadth over depth in order to cover what I thought were the key areas. Given that breadth, it is a lot of content, so strap yourself in for something of a whirlwind tour of the movement. I'm also just giving my considered impressions. I myself might update a bit after hearing thoughts from others, though I think one would get similar thoughts from someone else who's knowledgeable about the movement, but there may also be some divergence too. I also didn't really complete a formal analysis to reach these considered impressions. Instead, these are just what stood out to me in my judgment when I took the time to consider it. I also think the movement is great in a lot of ways too, but today I'm just focusing on what's needed, not all the things that are great about the movement. And given all those caveats and limitations, I think it's worth taking what I'm going to say with the appropriate amount of salt. I also want to apologize in advance for some potentially boring slides. I want to assure you the boringness of these slides doesn't necessarily correlate with the quality of the ideas that follow. And given all those caveats and limitations, I think let's dive straight into what I think is needed. And there's 5 things that I think the movement needs more of. The first is more quality evidence and analysis. The second is more programs to scale. The third is more funding. The fourth is more work in low and middle income countries. And the fifth is more workforce optimization. And by workforce optimization, I mean this kind of awkward umbrella term that captures attracting, retaining, and diversifying the talent base. The remainder of the talk, I'm just going to talk through each of these 5 things in a bit more detail. I want to highlight from the start that I don't think these 5 needs are mutually exclusive or collectively exhaustive. I just thought these kind of interconnected and overlapping areas were the best things to highlight in the limited time today. And I think the movement is also this, it's a complicated and it's a nuanced beast. These needs are going to apply to differing extents to the different parts of the movement. But taken as a whole, I do think they seem applicable to the movement as a whole. And I'm not really listing them in order of priority either, or really any order really. They're just numbered to help distinguish them and refer to them. And I think with all that said, let's go into more detail on number 1. So, need number 1. More quality evidence and analysis. So for this one, I think it's worth highlighting some of the context here, in that the movement, it's still very nascent, and by that, I mean it's very young. It's only really been around this past decade or so. And when it came into existence, it's not like it had this grand body of evidence to really draw upon. It's not like academics had already completed a lot of work, there was only a limited amount they had done. Similarly, it wasn't as if governments have really been plowing funds into this area either. There's actually a pretty stark contrast to the global health sector, for instance. And within that sector, it's something like $1 billion annually going to research on that front. For us, it's more like $10 to $20 million per year. So if you compare those numbers, you already have a ratio of about 100x, 50x. Global health has also been around a lot longer. So I think that helps put into perspective the kind of differing evidence bases that we have to deal with. And as a result, I think that means that there's just a whole lot of questions within our sector where more evidence and analysis would be quite useful. And that's everything from how might we improve wild animal welfare? How do we compare moral weights across species? What might be good to do in Indonesia? What food chemistry research should we prioritize on plant-based alternatives? And I think this evidence, it can take varying forms and be a whole lot of different methodologies. But for instance, these could be studies, it could be desk research, it could be experimental trials, monitoring and evaluation of existing efforts, and the list goes on. I think if you're interested in tackling some of these questions, I would encourage reaching out to either some of the organizations who are already active within the area, or at least kind of reading relevant resources. And actually, if you have an analytical bent and or a background or experience in philosophy or one of the related sciences, or something quantitative, or otherwise, chances are you're probably just smart and impressive if you're here today or if you're listening to this talk. And I think that it could be, doing independent research on one of these topics. It could be an area of mutual interest to you and the movement. And I really think you ought to consider either applying for a grant to work on something like this, or a fellowship with one of the organizations to work on this. So yes, please do consider it. And while doing so, please know that the goal of all this further research is often actually going to be need number 2. And need number 2 is more programs to scale. So I think very broadly speaking, we can divide effective animal advocacy at this point into these 4 programmatic areas, and it's depending on what they're trying to advance. These 4 areas are farmed animal welfare, alternative proteins, wild animal welfare, and invertebrate welfare. And within each of these program areas, we want to get programs to scale. So for farmed animal welfare, I think we are poised to find the next thing like cage-free hen corporate campaigns. That is something that is very cost-effective and highly scalable. So recall that from our estimates at this point, it seems likely that tens of hen years are affected per dollar spent on these campaigns. And once we find something comparable to that, I think we can pump a lot of funds into this. So a plausible contender might be something on fish welfare, but at this point it's unclear exactly what it will be. For alt protein, I think we're in a somewhat different position than other areas, as we more clearly have interventions worth scaling. So I particularly like lobbying governments for R&D funds on alt protein. And I think within the alt protein part of the ecosystem, it might now be more about finding the right balance of groups to work on this, and what precisely they should lobby for, and how to do that lobbying. But it's also still funding constrained too. And plausibly within alt proteins, there might also be something on corporate engagement there that we could scale as well. For wild animal welfare, I think it's a bit of a different story, as it's unclear exactly what we want to scale there. I think it might be something around, further funds to research, but my sense is that there we're much more in this scope and trial phase, this kind of research and hypothesis testing at this point. Similarly for invertebrate welfare, I think it's just, very nascent. There's only really a handful of groups that work on this topic at this point. And I think it's kind of unclear exactly what we want to scale there. Potentially, it could be something about lobbying or dissuading potential investors to that industry. But my sense is, again, we're kind of still more on this scope and trial and research and hypothesis testing point. But perhaps across all these different general programmatic areas, the common denominator is in finding programs to scale. And forever related to scaling is need number 3. And need number 3 being, we just need more funding. So effective animal advocacy at this point, it's currently at $60 million to $80 million per year. There's a bit of a range there just because it's a bit unclear where exactly we should draw the boundary. Open fill, which is a big foundation that probably everyone in the room is aware of, they're a substantial part of that. then there's something of a drop to the other big donors. ACE also plays a role, the EA fund too. One thing I'll highlight about that $60 million to $80 million per year is that there's still been significant growth year on year in that. So it was only a few years back, it was more at the $45 million, $50 million per year level. And it's growing at, by my back of the envelope calculations, it's about 20% year on year. And I would hope that that growth maintains for a number of years into the future. That way, say 10 years out, we could be looking at a movement that's $300 million plus. But it's, it's somewhat unclear to me how realistic that is. Here's what I think is realistic. I think if we really want to put a big dent into some of these big industries and these big problem areas, we need a total budget of at least a few $100 million annually. And further, if we want to grow to that size, I think there's various options that we should be pursuing to a greater extent. So one thing is I think we need to maintain a strong spot within the EA movement's giving portfolio. I think we need to remain excited by good efforts targeted at existing and new high net worths. There's probably other fundraising efforts that we could probably promote to a greater degree. And I think we really ought to look to have new and talented and experienced fundraisers join our movement. And I'll speak a bit more on that general point about talent in need number 5. But prior to that, I just want to note, with all this increased funding, we should do need number 4, and that is more work in low and middle income countries. So right now, we have a strong focus on North America and Europe. And I can see some reasons in favor of this. So there are arguably some of the places where it's most tractable or it's influential to other areas. But I don't really think those reasons are enough to justify the amount of the portfolio that currently goes to those regions. And in contrast, there are large parts of the globe where right now there's just very limited activities. For instance, most of the people and farmed animals are in Asia. There's still a whole lot of countries within Asia where there might not even be one group, or groups might have recently launched, but they're still very young. They only have a few staff. Their budget is less than $100,000 per year. And the other thing I'll say about a lot of countries within Asia is they're just quite large fish farming nations. So if we do kind of want fish to be a priority area within the farmed animal welfare scene, I think we do have to do more in a lot of those countries. And yeah, I mean, at this point, it's still just like a really limited amount of the overall funding is going to Asia. And another region we should be pretty aware of is Africa. It's projected high population growth, and with higher incomes that may result in increased animal protein consumption there. And, in addition to that, there's still a number of countries in the Middle East where basically nothing happens right now. So in all these different places, I think there's various capacity building activities and seed funding that are worthwhile abroad and that we should act upon. And then following that, it'll be a matter of, forming global alliances, regional alliances, having the national conferences, and really building up the scene there. And yeah, I think as we go about scaling and internationalizing, I think it is worth thinking about need number 5. And that's just more workforce optimization. And again, I know this is kind of like an awkward umbrella term, but I think it encompasses 3 main aspects, and that's attracting, retaining, and diversifying the talent base. I think to attract talent, we really need to have competitive salaries, good benefits packages, good working cultures at organizations, all that sort of stuff. And I think if you're either a funder or you're a decision maker at one of these organizations, I think it's like really worth paying attention to those 2 things. And then to retain talent, one thing I want to emphasize is first, if you're working within the sector, please really try and take care of yourself. I think we have a big problem of burnout or people becoming dissatisfied there, and there's a tendency to work really long hours, not take time off, all that sort of stuff. So please take time off, take satisfaction and enjoyment from other parts of your life. And again, if you're a decision maker at one of the organizations, I think it's just really helpful for retaining talent to set salaries at a good level and also have good benefits. And if your salary is kind of well below the median salary for one of the positions that you're offering, I think it could be worth rethinking that. And then again, in terms of retaining talent, I think a good working culture within the organizations themselves, that can be really important. Lastly, on the diversification of talent front, as I mentioned previously, I would kind of love for us to have more quality evidence creators. In addition to that, I think there's a whole lot of mid-career professionals we could do with. And that goes from everything from lobbyists to fundraisers, managers, entrepreneurs, locals and priority regions. And I'm not going to list all the varieties of talents that we need, but I think, again, chances are that if you're listening to this talk or if you're here today, I think there could be a spot for you within the movement. And I would really encourage you to consider it. So if you're at this conference, I'll be at the Careers Fair, or I'm happy to chat to anyone about this. Please come talk to me about it. Or email me, and my email is on the final slide. So to summarize, here are the 5 key and general things that I think the movement needs more of. 1, more quality evidence and analysis. 2, more programs to scale. 3, more funding. 4, more work in low and middle income countries. And 5, more workforce optimization. So I'm hoping that's all relatively clear, but given the scope, at the same time, it was probably a lot to process. But yeah, thanks everyone for listening today and for coming to the conference. Please feel more than free to contact me about anything at any time. And if you have a thought from watching or listening and would like to get in touch, go for it. And yeah, that's everything that I have for today. And on that note, I think let's transition to the Q&A.